In the middle of the night, as a light rain fell over the old tiled roof of the Reed mansion, the muffled sobs of a black maid broke through the silence, slicing the stillness apart. "Sir, the boy in that painting once lived with me at the orphanage." The words froze the wine glass in Alexander Reed's hand. It slipped, shattered against the marble floor. The painting hanging in the grand hall, depicting a blonde-haired boy with clear blue eyes, was the spitting image of the brother he had lost 32 years ago. Alexander Reed, a powerful, cold-hearted billionaire who had always believed the world was divided by skin color and status, now stood before a truth that could destroy everything he thought he knew. In the flash of lightning through the window, Grace's trembling face came into view, her eyes filled with pain and memories too heavy to speak. And Alexander, whose heart had been frozen by years of loss, felt it begin to tremble under the weight of one horrifying question. Was this poor woman lying? Or was the dark past of his family finally coming back to demand justice? In the heart of London, wrapped in mist and rain, stood the grand old Reed mansion, where everything ran with the precision of a Swiss clock. Cold, flawless, and devoid of emotion. Until that night, a choked sob echoed down the long, red-carpeted corridor. Grace, the new maid, thin and frail, her calloused hands still carrying the faint scent of dish soap, had fallen to her knees before the large portrait hanging in the parlor. Her voice trembled, breaking between shallow breaths. "Sir, the boy in that painting once lived with me at St. Helen's orphanage." The words, simple and trembling, struck like a thunderclap. Alexander Reed, the man who could sign billion-pound deals without blinking, went utterly still. The wine glass in his hand quivered. Dark red liquid spilled across the marble floor like a thin trail of cold blood. In the portrait, a blond boy with deep blue eyes smiled gently. A face identical to his brother Theo, the child who had vanished 32 years ago without a trace. In that moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The ticking of the wall clock echoed, steady, dry, and merciless, counting the uneven heartbeat of a man who thought he'd forgotten how to feel pain. Grace lifted her face. Tears slid down her dark cheeks. Her eyes held something between fear and pleading. And Alexander, after 3 decades of perfect composure, felt a foreign sensation stir inside his chest. Fear. The fear that the past he had buried so deeply was now knocking at his door. In the trembling voice of a woman the world had long chosen not to see. Grace's words cut through Alexander's heart like an invisible blade, tearing open the fragile illusion of peace he had built around it. He stood motionless before the painting, the golden light reflecting off eyes once cold as steel, now flickering with confusion. "What did you just say?" His voice was low, hoarse, and trembling with restraint. Grace bowed her head, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. The air in the room grew heavy, dense, as if even the walls were holding their breath. Only the sound of rain against the window and the ticking of the clock remained, each tick a reminder of years he had tried so hard to bury. And then, the past began to return, sharp, vivid, as if it had never left. Back then, Alexander was a happy boy, living in a house filled with his mother's piano melodies and his father's lessons on justice, a well-known lawyer praised for his compassion. The Reed family had once been the very image of upper-class perfection in London, until one bleak autumn morning in 1993, when his little brother Theo, just 6 years old, vanished in Hyde Park along with the new nanny, hired less than a week before. The police searched for months. Newspapers printed his picture. Rewards were offered. But every lead led only to silence. From that day on, his mother fell into depression, spending her days at the piano, playing the same sorrowful tune Theo had loved. His father, the man who had once defended justice for so many, grew bitter, closed, and cold toward the son who remained. In that house of fading light, only Alexander clung to a single vow: I will find you, no matter what it costs. 32 years passed. The world moved on. People forgot. But Alexander never did. And now, as a trembling black woman stood in his mansion, claiming she once lived with the boy in the painting, that old vow echoed through his soul, like a wound he thought had healed, bleeding all over again. That painting was like a door, one that opened to memories sealed shut for more than 3 decades. Alexander stood frozen, while Grace kept her head bowed, her hands clutching the edge of her apron so tightly, her knuckles turned white. After a long, heavy silence, he spoke softly. You said you met this boy. Where? His voice was hoarse, trembling, stripped of its usual coldness. Grace lifted her eyes, wet but unwavering. In the only place left where people still believe in miracles, sir. In a poor orphanage on the outskirts of London. Her story began in the darkest years of her life, where black children were seated at the farthest row of the dining hall, where bread was hard as stone, and dreams existed only in imagination. There, among the frail and forgotten, was a white boy with tousled blonde hair and blue eyes that shone like morning light. He always wore a strange, gentle smile, even though no one treated him kindly. His name was Noah, and he would tell the same story, over and over, a story everyone else dismissed as fantasy. That he had an older brother, one who used to call him Little Champ, and that his brother had promised to come for him one day. The other children laughed, called him crazy. Even the nuns told him he should forget the past and live his life. But Grace believed him. That small, dark-skinned girl believed in those clear blue eyes, in the quiet hope of a boy lost in a world divided by color and cruelty. Until one night, under a storm that tore through the orphanage, Noah vanished without a trace. On his empty bed, rain-soaked and fading, lay a single drawing. Beneath it, scrawled in uneven letters, were the words Grace would carry for the rest of her life. One day Big Brother will find me. And now, standing in this grand mansion, staring at that familiar boy's face in the painting, Grace understood. That day had finally come. Grace's story silenced the room. Only the sound of the wind whistling through the window remained, like a whisper from restless souls, long forgotten. Alexander listened, his hand trembling slightly as fragments of childhood flickered back. His brother's bright smile under the sunlight, the echo of a voice calling, Little Champ, among the apple trees. Everything he thought time had erased now returned, alive again in the trembling voice of a stranger. Take me there, he said quietly, his tone low but resolute. Grace nodded. And so, the journey back into the past began. The car rolled toward the southern outskirts of London, to where St. Helens Orphanage had once stood. When they arrived, only ruins remained. Collapsed tiles, shattered windows, like weary eyes, staring out at a world that had moved on. Inside, the air was thick with mold and the faint scent of melted candles. An elderly nun, frail but sharp-eyed, recognized the image in the painting Alexander carried. That boy, she whispered, her voice trembling. His name was Noah. I remember him well. He was different from the others. He always drew pianos, and he always called out a name, Alexander. She told them the boy had been brought there by a woman who claimed to be a nurse, saying his parents had died in an accident. Years later, when the records were reviewed, the sisters discovered every document had been forged. Then, the nun opened an old wooden cabinet and took out a crumpled, yellowed drawing. 2 brothers standing before a piano. The lines were shaky but full of feeling. At the bottom, Faded with time were the words, "My name is Theo Reed." Alexander fell to his knees, his shoulders trembling violently. Everything around him seemed to collapse. The brother he had believed dead all these years had not died. He had been hidden away, taken by someone's hand, within the very world of luxury and deception Alexander had once thought was safe. And for the first time, the powerful billionaire felt unbearably small amid the ruins of his past. The cold wind from the ruined orphanage seemed to follow them all the way back to London. Inside the car, Alexander sat in silence, his hand gripping the crumpled drawing until it nearly tore. Grace watched him quietly through the rearview mirror. Neither spoke, because sometimes pain doesn't need words. By the time the car stopped at the mansion gates, the rain had turned heavy. The sky hung low and gray, as if draping the entire estate in a tattered funeral shroud. Alexander stepped into the grand hall. Everything looked the same as it had that morning, but to him, nothing felt the same. The silence itself seemed alive and terrifying. That night, sleep refused to come. The wind slipped through the cracks of the old windows, carrying the scent of aged wood. Then, somewhere in the darkness, a faint sound began, a piano, soft, hesitant, as if someone were trying to remember the melody of a forgotten song. Alexander shot up, heart pounding, and followed the sound. Down the dim corridor, past the painting of the smiling blonde boy, until he stopped before the door to the basement, where his mother's piano had been kept for decades. Grace, sleeping in a room below, awoke at the same moment, startled by the same melody. Together, they descended the stairs. The basement was cold, thick with dust and the scent of rotting wood. Under the faint yellow light, the old piano stood there, blanketed in years of neglect. But what froze them both was what lay on the keys, tiny handprints, clear, fresh, as if someone had just touched them hours before. Neither spoke. Alexander's eyes stayed fixed on the darkness at the far end of the room, where something unseen seemed to be watching. Was someone still coming and going in this house? Or were the ghosts of the past beginning to wake after 32 years of silence? That night, after the piano fell silent, Alexander barely slept. The image of those tiny handprints on the keys haunted him, like a message from the dead, or perhaps a warning from the past itself. The next morning, he summoned Grace. "I want you to help me go through every record, everything about the disappearance," he said, his voice hoarse and weary, like a man waking from a 30-year dream. Grace nodded. From the moment she had entered this house, she knew. Some secrets weren't kept in drawers. They were carried in the blood of those who bore the name Reed. For days, Grace quietly combed through old archives, medical reports, and even encrypted files buried deep within the internal database of Reed Corp, the empire Alexander himself had built. The deeper she went, the less the pieces fit together. And then, one afternoon, something appeared on her screen that made her freeze. The DNA record from the police file on the missing brother in 1993 didn't fully match Alexander's genetic code. A fragment of it, an isolated sequence, matched something else entirely. A medical data entry stored within Reed Corp's own database, restricted to executive-level access only. Grace's hands trembled as she clutched the file, her heartbeat racing. She walked into Alexander's study, where he sat in silence before his mother's piano. Her voice shook, but her words were steady. "Sir, you've been searching for your brother. But perhaps it was you, or rather, your company, that once hid him." The room fell utterly still. Alexander looked up, his gray eyes wide with disbelief. What did you just say?" he stammered. Grace placed the file gently on his desk. "A sample of that boy's blood. It's in Reed Corp's database. Someone in your family used their power to bury the truth." Alexander staggered back, his trembling hand resting on the piano, the same one that still bore the faint prints of unseen hands. And for the first time in his life, he felt afraid of his own name, afraid that the Reed legacy he had spent a lifetime protecting was built upon the very crime he had been searching to avenge. Grace's words cut through Alexander's composure like a blade-piercing armor he had worn his entire life. He froze, eyes fixed on the file before him, long chains of DNA codes printed in black, numbers colder than grief itself. Impossible, he whispered, his voice trembling. Someone had used his own corporation to bury the truth? Someone who knew everything, who had power, motive, and perhaps someone he once called father. From that moment, a flame flickered within Alexander, not of rage, but of a quiet, relentless need to seek justice for the past. A few days later, he returned to the ancestral mansion, the keeper of every Reed legacy, and the one place he had sworn never to see again. In a storage room thick with the dust of time, Alexander found his father's old chest. The lock was rusted, but inside, buried among hundreds of yellowed documents, was a sealed envelope, marked with red wax and trembling handwriting. For Alexander, when you are ready to face the truth. As he unfolded the letter, his hands began to shake. The slanted handwriting of his late father read, "I committed the cruelest act to save our name from disgrace. The boy did not die. He was sold to protect our honor." The world collapsed around him. The letter slipped from his grasp, its fall echoing like a blade slicing through silence. He looked around the room, at the medals, the portraits of his father shaking hands with society's elite. All of it now nothing but symbols of a dynasty built on blood and prejudice. Alexander's eyes burned red. For the first time in his life, he realized he had not only lost his brother, but his faith in his lineage, his legacy, and the purity his family had once worn like a crown. And in that shattering moment, he finally understood. The past never sleeps. It only waits for the day justice dares to wake it. After that night, Alexander was no longer the man he once was. He would sit for hours in the dark room, the letter from his father lying open on the desk, beside a cup of cold tea and an old photograph of two brothers as children. Every line in that letter stabbed deeper into his heart. He was sold to protect our honor. What kind of honor could ever be worth the price of an innocent child? Alexander understood then. If he remained silent, he would be no different from the ones who had sinned before him. Grace, with the quiet compassion of someone who had known injustice, stood by him, helping him trace the last missing thread of truth. An old medical record led them to Brazil, to a charity foundation that had once received a mysterious donation from Reed Corp. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became. Someone in the past had sent Noah there, as if to erase his existence once and for all. And so, the two of them, a white billionaire haunted by guilt, and a black woman guided by faith, set off for Recife, a seaside town where the sun blazed bright enough to hide its shadows. At a small coastal market, the sound of crashing waves mingled with children's laughter, the scent of sea salt with a faint trace of oil paint. Grace stopped suddenly and pointed toward a corner. "Sir, look." Alexander turned, and his heart froze. A middle-aged man sat amid the crowd, his shirt stained with paint, his hair streaked with silver. Before him was a small canvas, a portrait of a little black girl, Grace's daughter. His hand trembled slightly as he painted, but his eyes, those blue, piercing eyes, they were painfully familiar. The moment their gazes met, time seemed to stop. No words were needed. In a single breath, Alexander knew. He whispered, voice breaking, "Theo?" The man smiled, a soft, weathered smile that carried a lifetime of storms and sun. "You took too long, brother," he said, his voice like the ocean wind, gentle but sharp enough to cut straight through the soul. The moment their eyes met, Alexander felt time collapse. pulling him back to that sunlit garden long ago, where little Theo had laughed and called him Little Champ. But the present snapped him back. The man before him was no longer that innocent boy, but a weary artist whose gaze held the depth of an ocean, heavy with memory and pain. Alexander took a trembling step forward. "Theo, it's you, isn't it?" he whispered. The man was silent for a moment, then nodded, a faint, fragile smile crossing his lips. "You took too long," he murmured, and then his body gave way. Grace screamed as Alexander lunged forward, catching his brother in his arms. He could feel the faint, broken rhythm of Theo's breathing, as fragile as a thread slipping through his fingers. In the distance, the wail of an ambulance siren echoed, but all Alexander could whisper was, "Please, not yet. You haven't told me everything." The Recife hospital glowed under sterile white lights. When the doctor emerged, his expression was heavy with unspoken truth. "He has a brain tumor," the doctor said quietly. "It's too advanced for surgery. His memory could fade at any moment." Alexander felt his chest tighten, as if crushed from within. He entered the room, where Noah, his lost brother, lay surrounded by tubes and the steady pulse of a heart monitor. Alexander's trembling hand reached out, gripping the smaller hand that once clung to his as they played around their mother's piano. "I'm sorry," Alexander whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Little Champ waited too long." The machines hummed softly, and then, faintly, Noah's eyes fluttered open. His voice was weak but clear. "I never stopped painting that house, Alexander. I always knew. One day, you'd find me, because only you remember the song Mother used to play." Alexander bowed his head, clutching his brother's hand as if anchoring himself to life itself. Outside the hospital window, the rain began to fall, each drop beating in time with their hearts. Two souls once torn apart by pride and prejudice, finally finding each other again in a world built on injustice and regret. The rain outside the hospital window fell without pause, as if the sky itself were weeping for the two brothers who had been lost to each other for more than 3 decades. Alexander sat there all night, never once leaving the hospital room. He watched Noah sleeping, his pale hand still gripping a small paint-stained frame, the only thing he had kept through years of wandering and exile. Every line on his brother's face was a fragment of memory, both foreign and heartbreakingly familiar. Grace sat quietly in the corner, her eyes red, but her lips sealed. She knew that some wounds could only be healed by truth. A few days later, while tracing Noah's past, Grace stumbled upon something strange. The charity that had once sheltered him, the Haven Foundation, had received steady donations from an anonymous benefactor for 10 consecutive years. When she checked the financial records, her breath caught. The listed sponsor was none other than Reed Corp, Alexander's own corporation. She rushed to find him, holding the documents tight in her trembling hands. "Sir, perhaps you've been saving your brother all along, without even knowing it." Alexander froze, staring at the certificate bearing his own signature. Alexander Reed. He remembered the fund vaguely. A recommendation from his financial advisor, meant to reduce taxes and enhance corporate reputation. He had never cared to know who it truly helped. But now, each figure, each line on that report cut into him like a blade. For over a decade, he had unknowingly sustained the very brother his family had stolen from him. Half his life had been spent building an empire on wealth, power, and pride. Yet he never realized that the same wealth had quietly been keeping his lost brother alive. Under the dim amber light of the hospital ward, Alexander let out a bitter laugh. "So, fate is just, after all," he murmured, voice low and unsteady. "Money can save a life, but it can never buy back the years that were stolen." That night, in the dimly lit hospital room, Alexander sat silently by the bedside, the soft yellow light reflecting in his bloodshot eyes. He still couldn't believe it. For 10 long years, he himself had unknowingly funded the very organization that saved his long-lost brother's life. Was it a cruel joke of fate, or the quiet arrangement of something, or someone far more just than man? Outside, the ocean wind carried a faint saltiness through the window, soothing the ache that bound the three of them together. Grace stood still, watching as the two brothers held each other's hands, one pale, one sun-darkened, both trembling in pain and love. A few days later, Noah began to regain consciousness. His memory was like a shattered mirror. Fragments of light flickered and vanished. But in his delirium, he kept calling one name, Teresa Hale. Alexander froze. That name echoed faintly in old family files he had once seen in his father's documents. When Grace investigated further, the truth that surfaced left all three of them speechless. Teresa was no nameless kidnapper. She had been the family's private nurse. The very person Alexander's father had paid to take the illegitimate child away, all to protect the family's reputation. Grace was stunned, and Alexander could barely breathe. The illegitimate child. The words rang in his head, shattering everything inside him. Noah, his brother, was the child born from his father's secret affair with a black woman who once worked in their home. The sin of one powerful man had stretched into a tragedy that spanned 2 generations. Alexander bowed his head, his hands clenched, his voice breaking. So this is it. The blood my father tried to hide. It's the very part that makes me pay the price. Grace remained silent. She stepped closer, her eyes gentle yet unflinching. Some things, she whispered, were never meant to be hidden, only loved. In that moment, Alexander understood. Forgiveness doesn't always come from others. Sometimes it begins with the courage to face the darkness within your own blood. The moment Grace spoke those words, the room fell silent. Her voice was gentle, yet it cut through centuries of prejudice, guilt, and the cruel legacy that the Reed family had carried for generations. Alexander looked up at the black woman standing before him, not with the gaze of a master toward his servant, but with the respect of a man who had just awakened. In that instant, he realized that his whole life had been spent defending the honor of the Reed name, when the only thing truly worth defending was humanity itself, regardless of color. In the days that followed, Noah recovered slowly, while Alexander spent long nights by the hospital window, staring at the faint stars scattered across the Brazilian sky. He understood now that revenge or exposing his father's sins would bring nothing but more pain. What the world needed wasn't another wound, but a hand willing to heal. Months later, back in London, Alexander announced the founding of the Helena Foundation, a charity named after his late mother, the only woman in the Reed family who had ever taught him that every soul is born equal. The foundation's mission was to protect lost children, especially those of color and those marginalized within the adoption system. Noah, though still frail, joined the project as a way to reclaim the memories he had lost. He designed the foundation's logo himself. 2 children, one white and one black, holding hands in front of a piano, with light shining behind them. When Alexander saw the sketch, he said nothing. His eyes simply filled with tears. For the first time in his life, the man who once believed power defined human worth understood a deeper truth, that love and compassion are the only light strong enough to erase the stains of the past. The day the Helena Foundation was officially founded, the London sky had never seemed so clear. Sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows of the new hall, illuminating rows of faces, of every color, class, and origin. sitting side by side. It was a sight Alexander Reed once believed impossible. Behind the grandeur of the ceremony, he stood quietly, his deep eyes following the orphans, laughing and running about. Every smile felt like an act of forgiveness, as if the past itself was finally being cleansed. In one corner of the room, Noah, the brother he once thought lost forever, sat beside an old piano, the very one Alexander had brought back from their childhood home. His fingers brushed the keys gently, his eyes glowing with a rare, quiet peace. That evening, during the opening night, the hall lights dimmed. A single spotlight fell upon the piano, where Noah sat, with Grace and her little daughter standing behind him, hand in hand. The first notes began, the melody their mother used to play. It wasn't perfect, not even precise, but it was warm, heartbreakingly so. Each note seemed to tear through the darkness of 30 years of separation, stitching back together the fragments of two souls, once torn apart by time and prejudice. Alexander sat in the front row, head bowed, his voice trembling, yet resolute. Love never disappears. It only waits for us to be brave enough to find it again. The cameras slowed. The entire hall rose to their feet, applauding through tears. The final light glowed upon two hands, one white, one black, resting together on the piano keys, beating in unison. Then a narrator's voice, low and tender, echoed like a whisper into every heart. It isn't blood that defines a family, but the love that dares to cross the boundaries of fear. The screen slowly faded to black, leaving only the lingering sound of the music of forgiveness, and of a world learning to bow before compassion.